A recap for you about what is called Lindbergh's triumph. He was born in 1902 in Detroit. He spent much of his childhood in a little town called Little Falls, Minnesota. He also spent time in Washington, D.C. His father was a congressman, and his father had a very strong anti-war position. He resisted American involvement in World War I. Lindbergh's youth was a lengthy series of moves. He went to as many as 3 schools a year in solitude. He did not have any friends. When he graduated from high school, he went to engineering school and he promptly failed. And in the biography that I read, it wasn't clear why he failed, other than he really wasn't interested in becoming an engineer. So he became an Air Corps pilot. He barnstormed. He was not able to stay in the U.S. Air Corps because they didn't need pilots. He had a reserve commission. He became a barnstormer. He also flew airmail. And in 1927, he decided to seek the Orteig Prize. And I've talked a bit about that prize lately. The first thing that he did was choose an airplane. And he decided on Ryanair, which was a small company in San Diego. He personally oversaw their development of the Spirit of St. Louis. The Spirit of St. Louis was not a production airplane. He changed significantly the production airplane that it was based on. He moved a number of things around, in particular the gas tanks. He made the plane aerodynamically unstable. It would have taken a skilled pilot to keep it in the air. And that helped him as he flew across the Atlantic Ocean, because he couldn't just settle back and let the plane fly itself. He had to pay attention to what he was doing. His flight made him a hero of immense proportions that none of us today can really conceptualize. He was the most important person in the world in 1927. He married a woman named Anne Morrow. And Anne Morrow was the daughter of the ambassador to Mexico. Their first son was born in 1930, and that's where this program picks them up. Following the birth of his son, he had given away the Spirit of St. Louis, by the way. He purchased a seaplane, and it was named Ting-Missertalk by an Inuit Indian. But he took this seaplane on a goodwill flying tour of the East. He started in Canada, went to Japan and China. Anne was his co-pilot on this tour. They had a son, Charles Jr., but a nanny took care of Charles Jr. while they were on this vacation flight. They were not trying to set any records. They actually started in Maine. They went to Canada and then on to Alaska. From Alaska, they crossed the Pacific to Russia, and from there they went on to Tokyo. So he was flying west. They were enthusiastically welcomed everywhere they went. Charles Lindbergh was a rock star. Everybody knew about him. They then went to China, and while they were in China, the plane with them on board was being lowered into the Yangtze River from an aircraft carrier. It was a British aircraft carrier, and it's not clear what happened, but the next thing they knew, the plane was upside down in the river. They were not hurt. Then Anne's father died. The plane was damaged, so they couldn't fly the plane home. so they returned by ship. I'm going to make a digression here because this is something that happened at the same time. He was introduced to a man named Alexis Carrel. Carrel had won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1912 for pioneering vascular suturing techniques. And Lindbergh started working with him on something called a perfusion pump. Together they developed this pump, which is a precursor to the artificial heart. They did not patent their invention because a patent had already been issued for the concept. What they did was improve on the patent that had been issued. It's a glass pump. It's used to preserve, at that time, animal organs outside the body. What it did was push artificial blood through the pump and into the organ. By so doing, they could keep the organ alive for weeks. And this is in the early 1930s. It was a machine that provided a sterile respiratory system to an organ that had been removed from the body. This perfusion pump was a significant step towards the feasibility of stopping the heart for open heart surgery. So in addition to everything that he did on a global scale, he was very interested in technology on more than one different time. Tragedy struck. He came back from that Asian tour and he was looking for solitude. He'd had his fill of the limelight. So they started a home west of New York City in the countryside of New Jersey. This house that they were building was very secluded. He moved into the home in 1931 with his wife, Ann Morrow, and the baby's nurse and the baby. So the four of them moved into the home in 1931. On March the 1st, 1932, this 20-month-old son, Charles Augustus Jr., was kidnapped. Here is an interesting piece of information. Lindbergh's precise location the evening that he was kidnapped was never clearly established. He was supposedly working in the laboratory on that pump that I showed you on the last slide, but no one stood forward and gave him an alibi. Now, the kidnapping itself. With the kidnapping, the three-ring circus that had been surrounding Lindbergh now for the better part of 4 years exploded into a worldwide feeding frenzy. It was absolutely the most significant thing going on in the world at that time. And what they found were indentations of a ladder outside the window where the baby was taken. The ladder itself was also located, not as it's shown there, but on the ground with a broken rung. If you look at the ladder, you will see that it is a homemade ladder. It is not a production piece of hardware. That ladder was going to be crucial later on. The state police were brought in. That's who took over the case. H. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., who was the chief of the New Jersey State Police, took over the investigation. I'm going to tell you some more about him on the next slide. The press went crazy. Reporters, photographers, and onlookers pestered the Lindberghs constantly. They had no privacy, no peace whatsoever. And what happened was they had handwritten ransom notes. One of them was left on the baby's crib. One arrived in the mail several weeks later. The ransom notes demanded $50,000 for his safe return. They paid the ransom. They tried to work the payment for the ransom with a sting, but it failed. The ransom was paid, and the person who got the ransom money got away. Fingers were pointed at many suspects. Lindbergh himself was suspected. They also had as a suspect the nurse's boyfriend. Speculations were endless. So what did Lindbergh do? Let's talk about Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, of German parents in 1895. He graduated from the military academy in 1917 and served in World War I. After the war, he came back with the rank of colonel. So in 4 years, he went from second lieutenant to full colonel. He left the Army. He was appointed in 1921 to head the newly formed New Jersey State Police. His role in the Lindbergh case was extremely extensive. He was credited with finding and prosecuting the perpetrator. In 1936, he was fired after he had a personality clash with the new governor. He returned to the Army and retired in 1953 as a major general. You know his son, Stormin' Norman. Now, the evidence against Hauptmann. The initial ransom note was written by a person whose grammar implied that he was a foreigner. Subsequent notes were similar. It wasn't that they were very awkward. Their English was not good. Later comparisons of his handwriting, and that's 1934 this was happening, confirmed that he was the author of the notes. The homemade ladder, the one that we're looking at on the right there, was assembled with pieces of wood from Hauptmann's home. They found wood. They actually went through a huge number of wood distributors to find that kind of wood, which then led to his house. It was a very extensive process, and they found in his attic wood just like the wood that the ladder was made out of. Using the serial number of the ransom money, they traced $11,000 of the ransom money to his apartment, and they found that money in his apartment. And the way they found him to begin with, he used a banknote to buy some gasoline that they had the serial number on at the state police had put out. Here is a list of the serial numbers of the money. And when he bought gasoline with that money, the gas attendant took down his license plate. That's how they got on to him. He never admitted the crime. To his death, when he went to be executed, he did not acknowledge that he was the perpetrator. His widow, who lived for another 50 years, never gave up pursuing getting his conviction overturned. Now, while the kidnapping investigation was in progress, and it went on for quite a while, the better part of 2 years, you see on the map the route of his airplane and the route of a ship. The Lindberghs took a survey flight in 1933 from New York to Europe. They returned via Africa and South America. So this is the route they were flying while the state police were trying to find the perpetrator of their son's kidnapping. The purpose of this trip was to explore potential air routes for Pan American Airways. To maintain radio contact with the couple, the SS Jelling, which was a Danish ship, was commissioned to follow part of their journey. So this was going on as they were flying around up in the Canadian North Atlantic area. The trip covered 30,000 miles over 4 different continents and 21 different countries. So while the kidnapping investigation was going on and they had not yet actually captured Hauptmann, this is what the parents were doing with their time. Tell you a little bit about Bruno Richard Hauptmann. 45 days after the abduction, the babe was found 4 miles away dead. He had died during the kidnapping. Schwarzkopf suspected gang involvement because kidnapping at that time was a very common criminal enterprise during the Depression. So what he did was he actually involved members of the underworld in his case work. In 1934, the police arrested this carpenter, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, and charged him with the murder. And I told you how they got onto him. They got onto him because he passed some of the money from the ransom. But they found proof as they were investigating. The evidence against him was strong. The ladder, as I said, had wood in it, very similar to wood in his house. His handwriting matched the handwriting on the notes. His participation in the ransom sting all served to convict him. He was convicted and executed in 1936. Back then, they didn't have 20-year stays of execution for everything in their brother. The Lindbergh kidnapping itself led Congress to pass the Lindbergh Law. That law makes kidnapping a federal offense if the victim is taken across state lines or if the U.S. Mail Service is used for ransom demands. That's the Lindbergh Law. It is still in effect. I didn't realize that it's not a federal offense if the victim is not taken across state lines. Now, what did he do next? He was devastated by the loss of his child, the investigation, and the trial itself. Notice his trip that he took to get himself away from all of the noise. He chose to flee America. The paparazzi was driving him crazy. He had no privacy whatsoever. And as he departed America, Lindbergh made a formal statement. You can read it, but he was highly critical of Americans in general. We have no discipline. Our moral standards are low. It shows up in newspapers, curiosities. Americans seem to have very little respect for the law or rights of others. So when he left in 1935, he was a very unhappy man. This attitude showed up very strongly in his future experiences in England, Germany, Russia, and France. So in 1935, he quit this country for a period of time. And he went to Europe. In the middle of this consternation, a second son was born. His safety was a very high concern. He'd lost a child. He didn't want to lose another one. In 1935, he and his wife and this new son relocated to Europe in search of safety. They settled in England, and they lived for a few years with their son in a 14th century mansion, long barn. While he was there, he renewed his relationships with Goddard. Remember I told you earlier about him and Goddard, the King of England, and very selected other people. He did not have an ongoing dinner party at his home. he was very selective about who he dealt with. At the behest of the U.S. military, Lindbergh traveled several times to Germany to tour German aviation facilities. And what he was doing was reporting on the German Air Force to the American government. He spent time with Hermann Goering and other German aviators. In particular, he spent time with Willy Messerschmitt and several other German airplane manufacturers. So he got very chummy with the German aviation industry. He examined and he flew the Luftwaffe's newest planes, the Junkers Ju-88 and the Messerschmitt 109. He was very much impressed with those airplanes. There was nothing like, as far as he was concerned, there was nothing like them anywhere else in the world. His next move was to France. He purchased their next home in 1938 on Ile Iliac, which is a small island off the coast of Brittany. It also is an ancient artifact. He purchased the entire island. It's a 4-acre island with a very old, antiquated home on it. He did not stay there long. This was the umpteenth home of the Lindberghs, but not nearly his last. His wanderlust knew no limits. Here he became interested in 2 new areas. One was the occult, and the second was eugenics. And the more you hear about him, the more you think that he really was a believer in the master race. But he got into the occult too, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. In 1938, he undertook, and again, at the request of the American government, a survey of aviation in the Soviet Union. He was not impressed with what he found in the Soviet Union. He found an Air Force that was no match for the German Air Force. That same year, he became an associate of the U.S. Ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, who was preaching appeasement to Neville Chamberlain. And he joined Kennedy talking Chamberlain into the Munich Accord, basically. As war loomed in Europe, he got involved in shuttle diplomacy among France, England, Germany, and Russia. He was flying back and forth, talking to people in the government, trying to prevent war from occurring. He wrote an article on German readiness. He praised Germany's aviation advances, and he encouraged America to catch up. And supposedly a lot of what we did in the period between 1938, 39, and 41 was to at least some degree stimulated by what Lindbergh had to say about the Germans. Now, the Order of the German Eagle. In October of 1938, at a party, Goering presented Lindbergh with the German Medal of Honor on behalf of Adolf Hitler. Lindbergh accepted the medal, and immediately there was an outcry in the United States among those who criticized the Nazis. They were saying he is a crony of the Nazis. He subsequently wrote a controversial article on German readiness for Reader's Digest. And what he said was, there's a coming war that will reduce the strength and destroy the treasures of the white race. Instead of war, it was time to turn from quarrels and build our white ramparts again. Sound a little bit chauvinistic. Henry Ford, I didn't know this, received the same award. Ford was busy labeling the international Jew as a threat to America. In the midst of all of this controversy, Lindbergh had been planning to move from France to Germany. He canceled that plan. He was asked to give the Order of the Eagle back to the Germans, and he refused to do so. What he said was it would be a slap in the face for us to do that, and as far as he was concerned, there was nothing to be gained by it. In 1939, following the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Lindbergh returned to America, but by now he had a different reputation, and it was going to get a lot worse. At the urging of Kennedy, he wrote a secret memo to the British, warning that the British-French response to Hitler's violation of the Munich Agreement, i.e., going into Czechoslovakia, going into Poland, would be suicide. Following his invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland, Lindbergh opposed sending aid to countries under threat. He actually vocally and in writing opposed our government aiding the countries that were under threat. He deplored the rivalry between Germany and Britain, but he did favor a war between Germany and Russia. So he believed that the master race ought to be conquering the Slavs. The greatest danger to America lies in there, and here we're talking about the Jews' ownership, influence in motion pictures, press, radio, and government. He made a number of very, very strong anti-Semitic statements, formally and in the press. For these actions, he was labeled pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. His approach was that the United States should stay out of whatever was going on in Europe. So he opposed American entry into World War II. They returned to the United States in 1939. He joined the America First Committee. And I'm going to talk some about that committee. I did not know very much about it. The committee basically opposed American entry into World War II. He became the leading spokesperson for the America First Committee. He made speeches all over the country to many different and diverse groups about saving our sons and stay out of the war. He criticized FDR's policies. His charge was, and he was making these out in public, the British, Jewish, and Roosevelt groups were leading America to war. You can imagine how well FDR responded to that. He then resigned his commission in the Air Corps after Roosevelt publicly denounced him for his stance. Many then were accusing him of being a Nazi sympathizer, among other things because he refused to return the medal that he had accepted. So while he was a part of America First, he was not, his fame had turned to something else. Most of the American people were not happy with Lindbergh's behavior. Now, the American First Committee was organized in 1940 in Chicago, Jerry. Its role was to prevent the United States from entering World War II. It was led by prominent American citizens and some members of Congress. Gerald Ford, for one, was on the America First Committee. Many communists made use of the AFC, as well as anti-Semitic and pro-fascist speakers and leaders. It was a very, very hard-line organization. It was aimed at enforcing the 1939 Neutrality Act, which Congress had passed and FDR had signed, which prohibited American ships from transporting passengers or articles of war to any belligerent, and it forbid American citizens from traveling on any ship of a belligerent nation. So the America First Committee was aimed at enforcing that act. It also opposed the Lend-Lease plan. They were opposed to sending arms and war material to Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union. And if you'll remember, the Lend-Lease plan was a pretty clever FDR program to get around the Neutrality Act. By the time the war started for us, it had a membership of over 800,000 people, most of whom were concentrated in the Midwest. It was not really a national organization. But they disbanded on December the 11th, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about Lindbergh in World War II. He volunteered to return to military service immediately after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. By then he was 39 years old, but he volunteered to go back into service. FDR would not accept him. FDR was a grudge keeper and said, "You are no longer acceptable to service in our military." His request was refused. He then served as a technical advisor and a test pilot for the Ford Motor Company, who was building B-24s, and the United Aircraft Corporation. He consulted on the design and production, in particular, of the B-24 Liberator. In April of 1944, he went to the Pacific as an advisor. He's a civilian now. He flew 50 combat missions. He developed cruise control techniques that actually increased the capabilities of the P-38 and the F-4 Corsair. So he had an active role in the war as a civilian. How he got involved with, this is a Lockheed airplane, and this is a Chance Vought. How he got involved in their particulars, I wasn't able to discover. He could stick his nose into just about anything he wanted to. So he was helping take this P-38, which they used for bomber protection, and extend its range. I'm going to talk some about extending its range. Now, a minor digression. He met with MacArthur and with a general named Kinney, who I've not ever heard of, who was MacArthur's airman. The issue was civilians flying combat and repercussions if he should be shot down. That was their concern. He said he believed that the combat radius could be increased almost 25% by cruising at lower RPM and higher manifold pressures. That saved fuel without danger of harming the engines. Manifold pressures and RPMs were set by the manufacturer. As long as they followed what the manufacturer said, their radius was only 570 miles. Lindbergh said, "I can do better than that." This caught General Kinney's attention. They decided that Lindbergh could continue flying as an observer, providing he did not fire any guns. The missions that he went on included bomber escort and strafing flights. On July 28th, during an escort mission in the Suram area, he shot down a Japanese plane. On additional missions, he dropped bombs on Japanese positions, and with his help, the P-38 and P-47 combat radius was increased to over 700 miles. Now, if you want to know how he did that, you have to look at this chart. And what this chart shows is what happens to horsepower as you increase manifold pressure. So what you can do is you can actually increase horsepower at a lower RPM by having a higher manifold pressure. He demonstrated that that would work. Horsepower increases with lower RPM. That improves fuel efficiency. I have no idea how they do that. Maybe Newt can tell us at some future date how that works. I don't know how you set manifold pressure. No idea. Later in life, what happened to Lindbergh? After the war, he lived in Connecticut, another house. He served as consultant to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and to Pan Am World Airways. So he had always kept his hand in with the airlines. President Eisenhower restored his commission with the Air Force and made him a brigadier general in 1954. From the 60s on, he became a green type of guy. He campaigned to protect endangered species like the humpback and blue whales. He was very, very much conservation oriented in the latter part of his life. He stressed the need to regain the balance between the world and the natural environment. Among other things, he spoke against the introduction of the SST. He built his last home in Hawaii on the island of Maui, and he lived much of his last years in obscurity, but he traveled back and forth to Connecticut. I guess he retained. He was a very rich man. If you remember at the very beginning when he wrote the book about his flight across the ocean, he made $4 million on that, and from then on, he never had a money problem. As he was dying of cancer in 1974, he was medevaced to Hawaii, and that's where he died and was buried in a family plot on the island of Maui. Maui is not a heavily traveled place, and his epitaph is Charles A. Lindbergh, born in Michigan 2002 and died on Maui 1974. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea. Now, does that sound like the end of the Lindbergh story? Epilogue. In 1957, Lindbergh, who was then 55, met and fell in love with a woman named Brigitte Hesheimer. She was a 31-year-old hat maker who lived in Munich, Germany. They began a long-term affair that lasted until his death in 1974. They kept their relationship a secret even from their 3 children. So he had 3 children with Brigitte. At the same time, he was also involved in a secret long-term relationship with Brigitte's sister, Marietta, and with a 3rd woman, Valeska, who was his translator and private secretary. So in addition, and he was not divorced from Anne Morrow. He had 2 children with each of the other 2 women. He may or may not have kept the 3 families unaware of each other. He certainly kept his family back in the United States unaware that this is what he was doing with his spare time. He would visit each of these mistresses 3 or 4 times a year. He would drive around in a little Volkswagen. He was known to the children as Mr. Carew Kent. I have no idea where he got that name from. But he visited these children several times a year, and he watched them grow up. In the summer of 2003, now Lindbergh has been dead 30 years by 2003, Brigitte's children published a book called The Double Life of Charles A. Lindbergh. And what they had done was they saw his picture in a paper, and they said, I know who that man is. That's our father. They then had DNA tests done that proved their case. That book is not available in the United States. And the man that wrote the book that I used for this whole program, his name is Scott Berg. He would not even listen to these people's information about Lindbergh. To my knowledge, he never acknowledged that all of this information was true. Now, interesting little piece of information. These are his children with Anne Morrow Lindbergh. He wanted 12 children. And I think there's something magic to him about 12. Think about it. There were 12 apostles. There's 12 months in the year. 12 was a magic number if you're into magic. And at the birth of the last of the 6 that he had with her, stopped. You don't get anything about how she went about stopping, but after their last child was born, there were no more. These are the 5 that preceded the last child. The only picture I can find anywhere of this family is the one on the right. He took literally hundreds of pictures of that first baby, and there were no more pictures that could be found about the rest of his children until after his death. Reeve Lindbergh was his last child with Anne. She was born in 1945. She visited all 7 of those half brothers and sisters. She wrote a book about it. It was mostly about her mother, Anne Morrow, but the book also included the experiences of visiting her half brothers and sisters. Now, these are the families that lived in Europe. The first affair began in 1957. Those were the pictures you saw on the preceding page. The next one is the Marietta family. This family lived in Switzerland, and I couldn't find anything about whether there was any communication between these 2 families. And then the third family with this woman named Valeska, surname unknown. Now, if you do the simple math, these 7 children plus the 5 children that he had still living from Anne Morrow comes out to be 12. Conclusions. Charles Lindbergh was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. His formative years made him a person who did not form many, if any, strong personal attachments. He was the lone eagle in real time. His accomplishments were broad and extraordinary in many different fields. He was survived by 12 children, and that's what he wanted. He suffered fanatical admiration and severe criticism in his life. Today, he would likely be described as a sociopath. That's a person who has little consideration for other people, one who would take advantage of others whenever it's necessary. He was also charming, he was intelligent, and he was dangerous. This program really doesn't do justice to the complexity of Lindbergh. His biography, and I really suggest that you read it, it's named Lindbergh by Scott Berg, is better, but it missed a chapter. Questions? Anybody there?
Yes, excellent, George. Thank you.
Yes.
I read a piece by Reeve Lindbergh, and she described how life when he was home was very stilted and uncomfortable and always awkward. And she didn't have a lot of sympathy.
I have not read it.
George, what about his childhood life with his mother and father? I mean, to have a personality like that, there has to be some connection between his younger days of life.
In an average year, Norm, he would move 3 times and go to either 2 or 3 different schools every year. His mother and father became estranged and divorced, and he spent very little time with his father except when his father was in Washington. So he would move between those 3 cities I talked about every 3 or 4 months. So he had no time to be connected to anybody. He was connected to his mother. He was a mama's boy, is the way you read the book. And I assume that's true.
I recall in the first program, the story of his grandfather, who had a secret, separate family back in Sweden. It was the tradition, you might say, of somebody in that family pulling off something like that. And I'm wondering if he knew about it, of course, that had happened in his family before, and he just took it to the next level.
Well, I read something that's kind of interesting, Willard. His father was illegitimate, okay, because his father was the child of his grandfather's mistress. His grandfather had to leave Sweden before he got arrested. So he was illegitimate. The fact that his grandfather married his grandmother does not make his father legitimate. So he was born of an illegitimate father. And that's just the kind of thing that makes sure that you're just not fastened to the world. You're floating around. God knows what you use for guidance and direction.
And in those days, anything like that was a much bigger deal than it is nowadays. You know, divorce was impossible back in the turn of the century, even into the 50s or even into the 60s. Anyone who did any of those kinds of things was anathema. But so in other words, he had a background that was really weird from his family, and then he just perpetuated it. Like, maybe that's the way I'm supposed to do things.
I don't think he concerned himself with convention at all.
Right.
I think that the number of children, and I haven't read this anywhere, but I think the number of children was a big deal to him. And if Anne wasn't going to have them, he'd find somebody who would.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's an interesting theory. I have no idea how to prove it.
It's amazing how his technological capability, I think, it sounds like, did these companies employ him because it was good publicity to have Lindbergh involved with them, or did they employ him because he really did contribute to what they were doing, whether it was Ford or Lockheed or anybody else?
I think it was both.
Yeah.
I really do. I think he was a genius as far as aviation was concerned.
He never went to college, right, George?
He flunked out. He went to Michigan State, but he didn't stay very long.
Okay.
He is. I have to tell you, I've read this biography, and biographies are usually pretty hard to slog through, but I found it fascinating. I really did. I had no trouble reading it.
He looked like he was a self-made psychopath.
Well, not a psychopath, because he didn't kill anybody that I'm aware of.
Sociopath.
A sociopath. Okay, a
The other
sociopath.
thing was he had more money than he knew what to do with. Think about
Right.
supporting 4 families. That's
Sure.
not easy. I don't care how much money you have. And keeping it back to
Keep the
having
secret.
read Reeves' book, my understanding is, someone asked me, did Anne know about all these other families? And what I have read was she did not, partially because she didn't want to.
Was there any books written about him by his children?
The Reeves book includes him, I assume. I haven't read it.
Well, Anne Morrow wrote one or several books, because I've known people, including my mother, who was of that generation, who loved Anne Morrow. I mean, from
She
what
is
she
very
wrote.
well thought up.
Yeah, I
Very
don't know
well
what.
done.
Yeah, I mean, she had a phenomenal positive reputation, despite whatever her husband was doing in terms of cozying up to the Nazis.
Although during that period of time, she actually cooperated with
Oh yeah,
the anti-Semitism and aren't the Germans good people? She worked with him on that.
I guess it was later though that she wrote her books. I
Well,
think.
she was writing even in college.
Oh,
She is
okay.
a very, very well-respected author.
Well, one thing that kind of bothers me a little bit is that when he was going to Germany and Russia, and then going back to the United States to basically tell them that the technology of the Germans was far superior than anything around, you would have thought that some of the Germans might have considered him a spy.
I think that what was going on, I mean, he was above the law, Norm. Nobody was going to, at that point in time, pick on him.
Yeah.
I don't know that they knew what he was telling the Americans.
I think the Germans were very happy to have him agitating to keep the U.S. out of the wars because it wasn't called World War II then. It was the invasion of Poland. It was the invasion of Czechoslovakia. He didn't want the U.S. to support the Britain in resisting the Germans. So I'm sure the Germans loved what he was doing and saying, let's keep America out of this thing.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, that's giving away a few secrets on an airplane was nothing compared, if he did, was nothing compared to motivating the American public to say, don't get involved with the war in Europe, because if we got involved, it was going to be with Britain. And it was with Britain. And
Right.
the Germans were desperate not to have that happen. And actually, who knows how long we would have stayed out. If the Japanese had not done Britain a favor by attacking Pearl Harbor, in which, a few days later, we decided, okay, I think Germany then declared, when we declared war on Japan, Germany then declared war on us. If they hadn't declared war on us, I don't think it would have been an automatic slam dunk that the with Britain would have happened, or the support, total support would have happened as soon as it did.
I always wonder, George, that there wasn't any communication between Germany and Japan. I mean, did Germany really realize?
Oh, yeah. The Germans and the Japanese had a non-aggression pact from way back earlier.
Yeah, I understand that, George. I'm just saying that the bombing of Pearl Harbor, I mean, I've always contended that if Japan wouldn't have bombed Pearl Harbor, maybe Britain would have fallen.
Yes.
And so what I'm trying to say is, why didn't Germany talk to Japan and say, hey, I don't think it's a good idea to go after Pearl Harbor like they did.
I agree with you. And Hitler declared war on the United States the day after Pearl Harbor.
Yes, yes.
So he probably had some idea of what they were doing. I think they believed that the United States, the isolationism, I think they believed that the United States would have made peace. I think they underestimated because we didn't have that much of an army. We didn't have that much of a navy or air.
Yeah.
I think the Germans were happy that when the Japanese did attack the U.S., that meant the U.S. was going to have to divide its resources to attack the Pacific Ocean, which didn't really matter at all to the Army. And therefore the resources that we were already providing to Britain become diluted, building Navy for the Pacific Ocean.
I
And
think you're right.
they weren't unhappy about that.
I think nobody had any idea of really appreciating what we were going to be able to do.
Right.
Because
I
it
think
didn't
you're
look
absolutely right, George. I mean, what, 15 million people joined the military. I mean,
Yeah.
that's unbelievable in itself.
And it wasn't just the people, it was all of the production of
Oh yeah,
and airplanes and ships and trucks and jeeps, all of the logistical things that the United States produced in 1941. You didn't necessarily know that's what's going to happen.
Yep.
Right.
Well, George, that was very good.
Well, I'm glad
Thank
you
you very
enjoyed
much.
it.
Mr. Purvis,
Jerry, you can turn it off anytime.
All right. Have a nice weekend, guys.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, George. We'll talk about manifold pressure another day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Time, awake.